In the last video, we learned about methods and the special value called this. Now we'll learn how to control the value of this with the methods call and apply. So we saw how this can be bound to an object by calling our method like gym.name, or by using our square brackets and calling it gym square brackets greet and invoking it with parentheses. This will be bound to Jim, or in this case, this will be bound to Nick, which provides us some useful functions in that we can reuse greet in several different objects, and this will provide a nice level of variability where we can have the same method be invoked on several different objects and always have the correct but different behavior between them. But we saw that there's a problem. As soon as we dereference or store a method into another variable, we lose that binding of this to that object. For instance, when we store gym.greet into the variable called gymGreet on line 28, the binding from greet's this variable loses its association with Jim. So when we invoke it on line 29, there's nothing for it to be bound to. So by default in JavaScript, it's bound to the window variable, which is not very useful. But what happens if we have to call a function as though it were a method on an object? So here's one thing we could do. Let's remove what is this. We don't need this anymore since we explored what this is when calling a normal function. So if we go back and we refresh, we can see we have three different things. First, we have hello, I am James, which you'll remember is for Jim, where we assigned .name here, so we can see that it gets the latest version of this .name, which would be gym.name in line 25's invocation of greet. And then we get Nick's greeting, which is hello, I am Nick. Now, what's interesting is we say hello, I am the window. And that's because remember that in this invocation here, gymGreet, this is the window. And so window.name we assigned to the value the window. However, window.name is a special property in JavaScript in the browser in that it actually names our physical window. All of the Chrome, the buttons and everything, it's actually referring to that actual window. And so name doesn't get reset every time we change our browser. We've actually named our windows, so it persists as long as this window persists. So we could actually, to change it back, we could do window.name equals empty string. And if we refresh, we now see what would be the default since the window name is now the empty string. But on line 29, that's not what we want to do at all. Instead, we want gymGreet to be called with the context of Jim, meaning this will be bound to Jim. And the way we can do that is through a special method built onto all JavaScript functions called call. So how do we do that? Well, instead of just invoking the function with our parentheses, gymGreet, which is a function, and a function is actually a type of object, meaning it itself has these key value properties. And one of those key value properties that is on every function is one called call, C-A-L-L. And this is a method which actually invokes itself. So when we call gymGreet.call, it's going to literally call gymGreet. But how this differs from normally invoking our function is that there's an extra argument added to the beginning of our method call. So we'll say, and that extra argument is what value should be bound to this in our invocation of this function. So in our case, when we call gymGreet, we want this to be bound to Jim. So if we refresh, we'll see now that that third call has Jim bound to this. And this is awesome because even though gym.greet came from Jim, we can change what it is on the fly. For instance, if we want to call it with a context bound to Nick, we can just do gymGreet.call, pass in the Nick object, and now this in greet will be bound to Nick. So Nick.name is Nick. So if we refresh, we can see it's now Nick. And in fact, it really doesn't matter what we pass it to. We could pass it an empty object. And if we refresh, we'll see I am undefined because an empty object doesn't have a value for the key name. And if we have an object like var obj for object equals the empty object, which is just curly brace open, curly brace closed, with no key value pairs. If we try to access a key, like name, everything is undefined, so that's why we get I am undefined. It doesn't matter what we have here, it's always going to be undefined. Or we could go a step further and just define as much of the object as we need to. In our case, we'll say emit. And if we refresh, we can see we say, hello, I am emit. And that's great. In fact, we don't have to even store this into a variable to use this because it's available on any function. So if we were to even call gym.greet.call Nick, what's happening? Well, we have the object gym, and then we're getting what's in the greet key, which is our function. Our function has a call method that's built in, which will invoke greet with a context bound to this. And that context should be Nick. So we could just do hello, and now we see hello, I am Nick. Now, besides call, there's another method that's built in just like call that works almost the exact same way. And that method is apply. And you'll see it's highlighted the same way call is in our editor. In fact, in this example, they're exactly the same. If we refresh, we get the exact same results. How call and apply differ is how they take arguments. Now, our greet function right now doesn't contain any arguments, but I'm going to change it around with a snap. Now, I've updated this function with a little bit more logic. I added two parameters that we'll take. First is the name of the person we're greeting, and the second is our current mood. Now, lines 8 and 9 here are to make name and mood optional. What we're doing is we're saying name equals, if name exists, we'll just say name is name and we'll not do anything. However, if name is undefined or false, we use the OR operator, and that's the two vertical pipes right here. This means OR in JavaScript. So this expression means name equals either name or you. If name is true, name or you will return name. However, if it's false, it'll take the right-hand side of OR. So this is a convenient way of saying if something is false, provide a default value. So if we pass in nothing, name would be undefined, so we'd say undefined, or if it's undefined or falsy, give it you. And the same thing for mood. So basically, if we just call greet with no parameters, we will get the name being you and the mood being good. So now that we got those two parameters that are optional, we changed our console.log here a little bit to integrate those. We're basically constructing a string by concatenating multiple things together, and I've just broken it onto different lines to make it more readable. So we'll say hello to the name of the person we're greeting, and that comes from up here. I am, and then my name by saying this.name. And then finally, and I am in a blank, which will be mood. So let's just see how that starts off. Considering that we haven't changed anything, these should now say hello you. I am James or Nick or Amit, and I am in a good mood. Now there is a little something I want to change. Looks like we should put a space right there just to alleviate where you and I are mixed together there. There we go. And now we have some parameters for greet. And we could see how that works. We could say, hello Ryan, and pass in a mood and just say awesome. And one of our invocations here will now say, hello Ryan, I am James and I am in an awesome mood. Well, in a awesome mood. But we're not going to change that to be correct. We'll just go with the grammatical error that is standing there. So how does this interact with call and apply? Well, let's take a look at our code. When we use the call method, what we can do is just pass in our arguments after our first argument. Remember, that first argument is the context of the object, which will be bound to this inside of our call. So after that, we can now list our arguments right after that. So we could say, hello, Matt, and then pass in our next argument. We'll say, I'm in a bad mood. So we'll refresh, and we'll see that it says, hello, Matt. I am Amit, and I'm in a bad mood. I don't know why Amit would be in a bad mood around Matt, but that's beside the point. How apply is different is instead of passing in our individual arguments like Matt, and Bad, we instead pass all of the arguments in as an array. So apply will, strictly speaking, only take two arguments, the first being the context, and the second is an array of arguments. So Matt will be passed to the first argument, and Bad to the second, and so on and so forth. So if we refresh, we can see the same thing works here. And that's the only way call and apply differ from each other, in that call will take any variable number of arguments, where the first one will be the context, and the rest of the arguments will be the rest of the normal arguments of that function. However, apply first takes the context object, and then takes a single array containing 0 or more arguments to be passed in. Now this might seem like an arbitrary distinction, however, apply, being used this way, provides us a really useful way to dynamically call functions. For instance, if we wanted to call a function with a set of arguments and we don't know how long those are, the obvious thing to do is anytime we have some variable number of arguments is to put them in an array. So we can say var args equals Michael, and let's say happy. Well, even if we tried to call Jim.greet, there's no way for us to easily just pass in those args like this. If we did it like that, then our args array would be bound to name here. And there's no real way to explode that out. Instead, what we normally do when we have a list of arguments stored in an array is called Jim.greet.apply. And even though we have Jim.greet here, we still have to pass in the context. So we'd have to say Jim and then args, and it works. Now you'll recognize this when it comes to it. It doesn't come up all the time, but sometimes you just end up with an array of arguments and you don't know how many items are in that array, so you can't statically break out those arguments in our code. Instead, we have to dynamically do it, and apply offers us a great tool to do that since it will take an array, which is variable, and apply it to the function, setting the parameters as needed. So now we've seen how methods work, but we're having a lot of duplication of our data between objects. In the next video, we'll learn how to use prototypes to clean that up.